far-flung families. Okay, now let's get into the message for today as we look at, I've already kind of shared a little bit about what this message is going to be about during the communion service. And so without too much fanfare, I'm just simply going to put up the theme, Yahweh God reaches out to the lost. Okay, that's the theme for today. We have seen God building this perfect paradise for the man and the woman and their progeny and all the plants and animals and the flora and fauna of the earth. All of that has been created and prepared by God so that the people that he created for fellowship with him would be able to enjoy their time with him for the rest of eternity. And then it got messed up. God had given a clear command to Adam and Eve. It was the man and the woman. Eve didn't have her name until after the fall. So it was the man and the woman. But there's only two people around. You don't need a lot of personal names, right? Okay. It was the man and the woman. And the man and the woman were in the garden, and they were enjoying God's presence and his power. And then it got all messed up. And we live in the mess-up stage, but fortunately for us, we also live in the fulfillment of the redemptive promise stage. Because before Jesus defeated Satan on the cross, the world was a far different place than it is today. You understand, today, we can impact things through the power of the kingdom, and they were in a different place with a different covenant, the Israelites, and before the Israelites, not much else happening either, and the whole world was under the influence and sway of the evil one, pre-Christ. And so as a result of that, it was a far different place. Post-Christ, we're living in something that has honestly been cleaned up quite a bit. It's still far from perfect. There's death in the world, there's sickness, there's all of those things, which means those are still the remnant evils that need to be taken care of and will be taken care of as Christ gets closer and closer to returning and then finally returns. So those things are going to all get cleaned up. Right now, they're there for us. Honestly, they're there for us to exercise our faith and to be able to serve Jesus and each other through exercising the kingdom of God. Honestly, it's training for reigning. That's what we're doing right now. And the Hebrews 11 scripture, which talks about the heroes of faith are being added in every generation. And it says sometimes the heroes of faith see the miraculous happening around them, and sometimes the heroes of faith do not see the fulfillment of all the promises. Therefore, the subsequent generations that God has reserved that. Well, right now, I think we're in kind of the end times. I suspect that means that we're going to see a whole lot of those promises come in simply because of the fact that there isn't a whole lot of world history left comparatively. 6 days God labored, and on the seventh he rested. That certainly speaks prophetically, and there's other scriptures like it, of a 6,000-year world history and then a millennium. And so that is something that we expect to be showing up. I mean, if you look at the Jewish calendar, it's, 5,800? And then if you look at the calendar as it's been computed through Usher and other chronologies, we're about where the Julian year is. And so we're at the slightly over the 6,000-year mark. And all those numbers are squishy because, you know what? We didn't have calendars back when the world was first created, you know? That's interesting. But there's some pretty good approximations. And it's pretty clear we're walking in the end times. So as you look at the prophetic, I had a message on this, are we on the end times? And then when I had that message, about a month ago, 2 months ago, I had that message on a Sunday, are we in the end times? The conclusion was, if we're not actually in the end times, we are in one of the last contractions before the end times break on the scene. And on that following Monday, Rick Joyner sends out a message that says the Lord Jesus appeared to him and answered the question of my message. Okay, now he didn't say that. He didn't say, the Lord said, answer Randy's message. No, what he said was, the Lord appeared to me and said, yes, we are in the end times. The day after I preached a message entitled, Are We in the End Times? And so I think that's pretty good evidence of the fact that we're in the end times. My message at the end says we either are or we are in one of the last contractions. And the next day, Rick Joyner says, no, it is the end time. It's not one of the last contractions. Okay, I thought, that's pretty good. Now that means we just need to buckle up. What's going to happen in the end times? There's going to be a tribulation, which is okay. Because if you've followed along with the prophetic theme that Rick has been releasing over the years, he said for Christians, you can't even feel the bump of the tribulation. The tribulation isn't for Christians. The tribulation is for the world. Now, that doesn't mean we won't be here, but we'll be walking in the power of the kingdom. By the way, there's a whole other economy in the minds of Christians where they suddenly go, whoa, we're gone. If you can find that anywhere in the Bible, honestly, anywhere in the Bible, you are a better person than me. And I'm a Bible scholar. Okay? It's just not there. If you didn't see the interview between Tucker Carlson and John Rich is the one who's done the song Revelation now. That's all over the charts and everything. It's an hour and a half interview, I think. It's long. But John Rich, who grew up as a rapture guy, dismantles it in that interview with Tucker. And Tucker's got kind of this incredulous thing. He says several times, I've read through the Bible once. Which is an honest admission of a guy that just recently has got interested in faith. But I thought it was, I'm thanking God that he's read through the Bible. But John Rich obviously has read through the Bible a lot more than that. and has a pretty good grasp of some things. So, I mean, he's not perfect, doesn't everything exactly right by any stretch of the imagination, but he's got a pretty good grasp of things. It'd be worth watching. So anyway, Yahweh God reaches out to the lost. We thank God we live in the economy that we do. We live post-cross because there's so much power being released. And we are actually living in the consummation of everything that was started here in the garden that we're reading right now and studying right now. So today we are in Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 13. And we are going to see, after God has created this whole wonderful place, that it gets destroyed. You know, my original title was The Serpent Messes Up Paradise. And then I realized that's burying the lead. What that means is the main subject is God reaches out to the lost. That's the main message of this section of Scripture. Okay, Genesis 3:1. This is not a pleasant section of Scripture because we are all going, oh, no, don't. But it did happen, and it's history 6,000 years ago. There's not much we can do to change it. The serpent was more clever than any animal of the field which Yahweh God had made. The serpent said to the woman, indeed, has God said, you shall not eat of any tree of the garden. Notice I used a British accent because, of course, I want to distance us from Satan as far as possible. And it was a pretty bad British accent, but the serpent shows up and gets messed up. So the serpent was more clever than any other animal of the field. And actually the word clever could be translated wise, but honestly, because Satan certainly has a bit of wisdom, but not godly wisdom. And so usually when we talk about wisdom, it's a positive thing. And so we will talk about, we use like the words clever. Some you might be able to say intellectual, bright, whatever. That's who this serpent is. By the way, the serpent is never identified in this section. In fact, throughout the book of Genesis, as things go on, you find out more and more about the evil opposition. But at this point in time, not a whole lot being told us about the entity behind the serpent. Now, so the serpent shows up. A whole lot of questions about this. Okay, he's clever, able to think on his feet. That's not a pun. Wasn't until after the fall that he lost his feet. Okay, maybe it was a type of iguana. I don't know. But Obviously, this is a clever animal, but here's the thing. He's talking, which means there perhaps pre-fall was a rudimentary ability of animals to speak. Now, this one's clever, so it has very good speech. Eve and Adam, who was with her, did not find this odd that they were having a conversation with this animal. And so you can imagine the simpler animals would have simpler communications. I mean, there's some prophetic stuff right now where I know Bobby Conner had that experience where cows started talking to him in kind of cowy sounding voices. It's you, that type of thing. I've had conversations with deer very one way, but I've called them in and they've come down and they've listened to me until I said they could go, and then they leave. Okay, so that is, there's some kind of communication that can happen with animals. Anybody that's had a dog knows that happens. They learn to read us at a certain level, although their speech has been taken from them. So I'm one of the guys that thinks animals could talk beforehand, and I think the evidence for the fact that God can mess up speech is the Tower of Babel. He did it to the world of human beings. He could certainly do it to the world of animals as a result of the fall. And it would also be why the creation is looking with eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed, because if they've been reduced from animals with speech to animals that can't communicate except through grunts and noises, how frustrating would that be? Okay? Very. So the serpent is showing up on the scene, and he does this, he implies something about God, but he wraps it up in a question, because the best way to insinuate something about someone is to make it a question. You're not accusing, but you are. Human speech is pretty sophisticated, and if you want to accuse someone, you can do it wrapped up in a question. You can do it wrapped up in a lot of different ways and make it look like, oh, no, what do you think I said that for? I didn't mean that. He meant it. Okay? It was a negative implication wrapped up in a question. And the implication is God withholds good things. Okay? This is just the serpent saying, I heard that God said you can't eat any of from the trees of the garden. Wow, man, look at all this wealth of food around you and you can't eat any of it. But that's just like God. So there's this implication right up front. God is not good and he's not generous and he withholds good things from you. And that is built into the question. This is a very clever attempt on the part of the serpent. And you'd expect that from the entity that is energizing him behind the scenes. We know that Satan entered Judas to be able to come after Jesus, so we can imagine that he did the same thing in this particular instance for whatever reason, and that this serpent was open to it. Because, by the way, the serpent gets cursed. And Satan gets a prophecy of his defeat, but the serpent gets cursed. So there was some willingness on the part of the serpent. There was some culpability. There was something the serpent allowed that it should not have allowed in a perfect garden. And so the implication was that God withholds good things. Remember last week when we looked at Genesis chapter 2, it says, after Yahweh God took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to care for it and keep watch over it. This is exactly the reason that God put him in the garden, to keep watch over it, because there were beings who were not supposed to be in the garden. And Satan was one of those beings, and he would be involved in trying to get his agents into the garden, and this serpent was one of them. So Adam is with Eve, and he's failing at his guarding, or he's keeping watch. We usually focus just on Eve, but guess what? He's there, and if he had been doing his job, there would have been no temptation. Adam wasn't doing his job. By the way, that's a message to all of us. We need to do our jobs. Because if we don't do our jobs, things can go wrong. Openings are there in our life or our family that the enemy can drive a truck through if we are not doing our jobs. As I said that, the first thing that comes to mind is we live in a world of internet connectivity. And if you are a parent, one of the jobs you have is to protect your kids from internet connectivity. Because you talk about the evil stuff that's available at the click of a button on the internet, and children are not prepared to protect themselves from that stuff, which means a parent needs to watch over or guard over the garden that God has given them, which is their family. And if that's too much work for you, smash any devices they have, because it will lessen your culpability before God one day. And if you think I'm kidding, Jesus said it'd be better for you to cut off an arm or pull out an eye than to cause, to stumble into things if it's causing you to sin. And God forbid, Matthew 18:6, that you cause one of these little ones to stumble by not doing your job of guarding them. This is serious business. And I'm speaking very seriously as a result of it, because it's one of the primary responsibilities we have to be able to protect those that God has entrusted to us. So Adam wasn't keeping watch, and if he would have been, this conversation would never have started. This was a team effort. It wasn't just Eve. The woman. Okay. Genesis 3, 2-3. But the woman replied to the serpent, "We may eat from the fruit of the trees in the garden, but from the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God said, do not eat from it and do not take from it, or you will die." So Eve's response is a pretty good response. She, by the way, probably should not have even gotten into this, because the implication came with a hook that was from Satan to imply that God was evil. So they probably should have just said, "Barbecued serpent tonight." Okay, now, of course, they wouldn't have, but, understand. They needed to break off this conversation right away, but Eve engages it. You ever walk by, when I was a kid, this would happen. You'd get to the carnival, you'd have $5-8 in your pocket. That's how long ago I lived in, it'd be at carnivals or fairs. And there'd be the hawker by the whatever booth. And their job was to draw you in, right? To get them in. And then they'd show you the little duckies or whatever it is that they were doing, right? And these things are scams from the moment you get there. But as a kid, you don't know that. And their job is to engage you, because once they get you engaged, they've won. Because they know your inexperience does not match their gab. And so what happens is you can get emptied out of all your precious dollars before you've walked 5 minutes into the fair. Now there's not even any popcorn or cotton candy available, because you've just spent it all at a duck booth. Some stupid thing. So this is what Satan did. He engaged her, and instead of walking away, instead of passing by the booth, "I can hear you," she engages. So the woman responds to the serpent. By the way, it wasn't Adam. Adam, the guard, the watch, doesn't respond. The woman does. Now, maybe it was because Adam was 10, 15 feet away, and so Eve's in this conversation, and Adam is like, wow, but he's still not doing his job, because he was supposed to protect the garden from things like this. But once he saw it, he had to be there and be on top of it, and he just wasn't on top of it, to put it mildly. So the woman replied, not Adam. He wasn't doing his job. And remember, God had made him the role of the spiritual head by giving him the commands before he even created Eve. So Eve is just repeating what she heard from her husband. So the woman replied, not Adam. And she said, "We may eat from the fruit of the trees in the garden." So she's defending God. And where she shouldn't have been involved in the conversation at all, she's defending God. We may eat from the tree, which is from the fruit of any of the trees in the garden, but we may not eat of the one tree. The one tree is withheld. We know it as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And she says we're not supposed to eat from it or take the harvest of it. By the way, inevitably, and those of you who have been around me for a while know, the Hebrew word translated, a lot of translations say, nor are we to touch it. And inevitably, it's inevitable. I've read tons of commentaries. Inevitably, they'll say Eve already was stepping into lie and falsehood. The fall hadn't happened. Can I say that louder? Dawn says no. The fall hasn't happened. See, I can emphasize it with doing that way too. The fall hasn't happened. Eve was not lying. Eve was not adding to the command of God. The Hebrew word can mean grasp or take. And so anyway, it's not good to bear false witness, especially against the mother of all the living. Honor your father and mother, that it may be well with you and you may live a long life on the earth. And if you start out by dishonoring the woman and calling her a liar before the fall has even happened, you're not doing such a hotsy-totsy job. Think I have an opinion on that? Yes. And I think what I've just presented to you is a pretty rock-solid, tight argument about why she did not, number one, the meaning of the Hebrew word, but secondly, beyond that, the idea that she would have started lying already would be like, we're being anachronistic. We're taking our culture and who we are today and putting it back in the garden before the fall into sin. And that makes no sense. So anyway, you can see I don't get up and walk out of anybody's messages unless they started proclaiming that Jesus is not the Lord or something like that. But when someone's speaking and they say that, I go, check. It's just a little thing that lets me know that they're not thinking through all the issues involved. And so if it's someone that I've got influence with, I'll talk to them later. If it's someone that I don't have influence with, I'll just tell them, have a good day. Bye. You're not my responsibility. Do your own master, you will stand and fall. So I'm not, you stick, what is your realm of responsibility? Okay. So the serpent then says to the woman in this discussion that should not even be happening, you too certainly will not die. For God knows that on the day you two eat from it, your eyes will also be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Nice. Contradicting God. Just flat out contradicts God. Just says, okay, I've put enough of a doubt out there. Now I can just set the hook. So the serpent said to the woman, you certainly will not. God said, dying you will die. No, certainly not dying you will die. Flat contradicting God. And he says, God, instead of ending the conversation, of course, this thing continues, and he says that God has got an issue. By the way, it's a plural you. Doesn't come out in the translation unless you do something to actually point it out. He's having a conversation with Adam and the woman, with the woman and the man. And he's having this conversation all the way through with the woman and the man. It's a plural you, which means we usually think of Eve by herself. He's having this conversation with both of them, as we see at the end. So he was addressing both of them. And he says this is what he's saying. God's keeping a secret from you. This is where the world of conspiracy theories come from. You know, every conspiracy theory is there's a cabal or a group of people that's got more information than we do, and they're doing their thing. That's a conspiracy theory. So I'm not saying that means it's wrong, because there often is a group of people that are planning a certain way, and they don't have your best interest in mind. That's the way it is. And by the way, that's just the way it is. Other nations do that all the time, and whatever. But here's the conspiracy theory. God doesn't want you to be like him. He's got ulterior motives. And that hook hit. Be careful with conspiracy theories. In Isaiah, we're told don't call everything a conspiracy that they call a conspiracy, but in your heart set apart Christ, or God is Lord. And that's good advice, because conspiracy theories are, from their very beginning, designed to put us into unrest. It doesn't mean they're not true, but they're designed to put us in unrest. And so you got to make sure that you're always staying in rest. If you're not in rest, you are compromised. So he's saying, in essence, God doesn't want to share what he knows. Okay. Now remember the essence of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is what we need to understand about it. First of all, God had said the entire harvest of the tree is mine. In an agrarian culture, they needed to give that one tree to them. The rest of the garden was there. That tree was the one that they were supposed to give the offering to God from, which means all of the harvest. 2, it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. See, the way they knew good up to this point is what God told them was good. By the way, that's the way that we as Christians need to understand what good is. We read the Bible and find out what God says is good, and then we open our hearts to his Spirit so that he can lead us in personal decision making, and we can determine what is good. And then, apart from that, we ask for God's wisdom so we can determine what is good. Because the issue for us is up here, as we try to determine what is good, we come up with wrong conclusions. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You want a prime example? It's the abortion debate. What has the Spirit of God said? Life is important. Read Genesis 1 and 2. It's all about life. The whole book is about life. John 1 is all about life. It's about the importance of life. And life is the theme of the Bible. So when we're talking about the unborn, life has to be the revelatory theme from God. But you know what it says up here? Well, there's got to be reasons that we can do, especially because it could cost us politically. You understand? That's here. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When anyone is making those arguments, it's the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of life, which is Jesus Christ. Because we're making our decisions based upon what we think is correct and the best way to go for our best interest, as opposed to the way that the Lord leads us to go. Usually the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not going to call us to sacrifice on behalf of other people. Well, that's just stupid. God calls you to a 20-day fast. That's just stupid. Who would do that? You can harm your body. You can cause all sorts of issues, you blah, 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 where the Spirit of God is saying, hey, I want you to set aside some time for me. And I'm not talking about a full fast, but you understand, I'm just saying if God's speaking, and he's speaking in our spirit, we follow him. Even though up here it makes it sound like it's absolute ludicrous. See, we live on the tree of life. We follow his plan for our lives. Read the Bible, lean on Jesus, use the wisdom that he has given us, and suddenly it says in Hebrews 6, when we've trained ourselves, at the end of Hebrews 5, beginning of Hebrews 6, we train ourselves to be able to know good from evil as we take from the tree of life. That is how we develop. We get away from, I know everything and I can make decisions. We know very little about what's going on in the world of politics. We just really do. It's one of the most manipulative things in the world. I was talking about carnies a second ago. They are amateurs compared to politicians. Okay, just the way it is. And so we got to realize we are getting played by both sides. You got to figure out what is God said. I am not interested in supporting any politicians unless the Lord has spoken to me about them, or God has spoken to the prophetic movement, and that way through me. And as a result, that helps me when I'm making decisions. I am not supporting any politician because I believe anything about them that they are in and of themselves capable of handling the problems which are in front of us. However, I will support a politician that I believe that the Lord has anointed, and the Lord has indicated that he has anointed them. Okay, that to me is like gold. Okay, I've already mentioned one today that I believe the Lord has given us, one of those thumbs up things, and said, this is a man after my own heart. So, this accusation against God obviously bites. So the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was pleasing in appearance and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. And she took from its fruit and ate, and she also gave it to her Adam who was with her, and he ate. Okay. The woman entertained the temptation. Didn't turn and walk away. Some temptations you just have to walk away from. You just do. I mean, you just go, no, but they come with supernatural power behind them, because guess who's behind them? The enemy of our souls. He's a supernatural being. What I mean is that there's a world system that we live in governed by basic physical laws, and then there are things that operate outside those those laws, super above the natural. And those energies, and by the way, the Greek word energia can refer to supernatural energy from the outside of our natural system that comes either from God or from Satan. So there are supernatural energies. These things can come with major hooks. And the only way to deal with them is not to think them through, but to turn and walk away from them. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. She didn't do that. James says this. I think James was thinking about this situation when he wrote this. No one should say while being tested, I am being tested by God, for God is not experienced with evil, and he doesn't test anyone with evil. But each man is tested by his own desires when he is lured and hooked by them. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is grown up, produces death. Well, I think Eve is and Adam right here are one of the primary examples of death. By the way you break this commandment, dying you will die. You will most certainly die. This is the model, Eve, what she was facing, what the woman was facing. She entertained the temptation. The tree was a first fruits temptation. I've talked about that. If you've read that, really wonderful. Yeah, this is product placement. Created to prosper. Okay. I go in detail about why this is a first fruits offering. And right from the very, very beginning of creation, we've been taught to tithe from this incident, from God saying, this is my tree, because it was definitely a first fruits offering. And you can easily see that because all the trees of the garden had good appearance, and all of them were good for food, but this one was desirable to make one wise. It had an edge over every other tree in the garden, and at that point for her, it was the best in the garden. And that's what God says, you offer to me. This was her opportunity to be able to give a sacrificial offering to God. And she blew it. Which is, by the way, why greed so much covers human life now. Because it's the original sin. Greed. So this tree had an edge over every other tree. And then it says, she took from its fruit and ate, and she also gave it to her Adam, who was and we all know you could translate that husband, or you can translate that her man. But I think it's kind of cute to put her Adam. So she gave some to Adam, and that is the real puzzling part. He fell down on his job. He did not watch over the garden, and then he got involved in the sin. And here's what Paul says about it to Timothy. Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but when his wife was deceived, she became disobedient. Adam wasn't deceived. He knew it was wrong. What in the world was he thinking? And you know what? We've only got speculation. We have no answer. Okay, we've only got speculation. Maybe it was that this woman's is now lost and I cannot bear to be without her. That could be. Okay, remember, they were perfectly bonded. She was the help created for him, a complement, filling in. She was taken from him. And maybe it was simply this: there was no way that he could contemplate going forward without her, and so he'd rather go forward into the unknown with her than without. That's not a noble sentiment, that's a selfish sentiment. Because of how he was dooming the rest of humanity. And remember, he didn't know about redemption. For all he knew, he was consigning him and any humans after him to an eternity separated from God in absolute misery. There's no noble way to cut what he did. It's just there's none. So, when they ate, the serpent was right. The eyes of both of them were opened. And the horror that accompanied it as they realized they had been duped. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they recognized that they were naked. They stitched together fig leaves and made for themselves coverings for their procreative areas. And that's just about as clear as you can state it, that they suddenly realized, they experienced death instantly, death of innocence. They lost their innocence. They lost that state of what we call sinless grace. They lost all of that, and they realized they had been completely filled with greed, which is why sex now became a weapon. They were filled with greed. Greed, the greed that evidenced itself by withholding the harvest from God, now affects every area of our lives, including our sexuality, which is what lust is all about. It's that greed withholding from God that now goes into all that sexual lust and every other negative form of greedy desire and longing, which manifests itself in the human heart now as a result. And so they experience death instantly. Now they knew good and evil, which means they were going to be able to evaluate things apart from God's input. That means up here, not here. In fact, they were cut off from God. They had nothing here. Which means now good and evil were going to be determined purely by their own wisdom and understanding, not their connection with God. Now, God was going to intervene and stop that. But at that point in time, they couldn't make any decisions connected to God. Because dying, they died. When you die, there's 3 types of death. And I usually put the graphic up, and I didn't think of it. The first one is that we know of course, is physical death. People die. Their soul and their body are separated. The spiritual death is when our spirit is separated from God. And this is where Adam and Eve were. Their spirit was instantly severed from God. He had breathed into them the breath of life, the spirit. That was gone. And then eternal death is when spirit, soul, and body are separated from God eternally, and we call that in the lake of fire and all that good stuff from the book of Revelation. So now they would be able to evaluate things apart from God, and they knew now that up here, sexuality was an embarrassment because it could be misused, so they got involved in doing something. Now, by the way, a lot of times people say, what was the fruit of the tree? And it wasn't an apple. You all know it wasn't an apple. It was not an apple. There was, it's a similar, in Latin, which is what the Bible was written in by Jerome, in the early parts of this millennia, of the time we lived, the 2,000 years. The Latin word for apple is the same virtually as fruit, something like that. And so that's why it got the idea of it being an apple, but it's not. This was more than likely a fig. How do we know? Well, they didn't leave the middle of the garden. They stuck around the middle of the garden. We'll see that in just a minute. And they were there when their eyes were opened, and so you would think maybe the tree they just ate from was the tree they grabbed the leaves from. So the best bet is that it was a fig, which is why figs are disgusting. I actually, at one point in my life, to my great embarrassment, liked fig Newtons. Anyway, okay. They did what they could to deal with the state in which they found themselves. And so they got, some translations say loincloths or whatever. It's not an easy translation because it's just talking about basically swim trunks. They made with fig leaves, which apparently aren't like the really good thing that you could do. They didn't get out their sewing machine and do all that. They just did, however they did it. We took vines and did whatever. They stitched things together and did what they could do. Now we get the very interesting thing. God shows up. How long did it take before God showed up? I think probably a couple minutes. I think they had about just enough time to get these fig leaves sowed. The Lord's waiting on the edge of the garden going, fig trees. Fig leaves are almost in place. Okay. And then he decides it's time to show up. So they heard the sound of Yahweh God coming through the garden as the spirit of the day. And the man and his wife scurried for cover away from the presence of Yahweh God by the tree in the middle of the garden. See, they're still in the middle of the garden. They haven't left. Now they're trying to get as concealed as they possibly can because they hear Yahweh God coming. And the sound of Yahweh is, something which sometimes you translate it voice or whatever. The sound of Yahweh, and you think, what's Yahweh sound like? Well, let's look at Exodus 19. When the morning of the third day arrived, there were loud sounds and flashes of lightning, and threatening clouds were over the mountain, and there was a very loud blast of a trumpet, and all the people who were in the camp trembled with fear. There were earthquakes, and all sorts of bad stuff was happening. And the people in Israel said, we're trembling with fear. Please, Moses, could you talk to him? I think that when we think that God just showed up, they were scurrying to hide. Why? Because it was Judgment Day. That's what was going on. It was Judgment Day. He was coming into the garden in the spirit of the day. Remember when we talked about the day? I told you how important it was because the day represents evaluation. It represents judgment. And I know that most translations will say in the cool of the day or in the breezy part of the day because it obviously brings some type of relief. And again, that's anachronistic. This was a perfect paradise created by God for naked people. Do you know how climate controlled it had to be? The idea that there was a cool of the day as opposed to a non-cool of the day is ludicrous. And the word spirit doesn't mean cool. It means spirit. Now, it can be used to mean wind, the wind of God. Same thing in the Greek. Its spirit can be used as wind too. I mean, there's always this play on words. You always have to determine what it's talking about. But this is not talking about the weather because that would be an anachronism. There was no weather except perfection. He came in a spirit. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and then we hear in Genesis chapter 1, this is where we get it from. Then God said, let there be light. Ooh, there's light. God saw the light that it was good. Oh, he's making an evaluation. Light is good. He's evaluating. And God made a distinction between the light and between the darkness. There's dark and there's light. God called the light day. Day is when he makes his evaluations. And the darkness he called night. There was evening and there was morning, a first day. And back when we talked about that, I shared about the fact that the day in Scripture, the day of the Lord is coming. What does that mean? It's Judgment Day. It's always Judgment Day. The day of the Lord is coming. Sometimes the day of the Lord can come to a nation. That's Judgment Day for a nation. They're being weighed in the balances. I think that's happening in the United States, and I think we're still kind of on the cusp. But the Lord comes in the spirit of judgment. He's about to evaluate and pronounce judgment on the man and the woman. And the man and the woman scurried to hide from the presence of God, and they hid next to the two trees in the middle of the garden. By the way, that'd be a great book title, Two Trees in the Middle of the Garden. Rick Joyner, you should read it. Then Yahweh God summoned the man and asked him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard your sound in the garden. I was afraid because I'm naked and I hid." God said, "Who made you aware that you're naked? Have the two of you eaten from the tree, the one from which I commanded you not to eat?" This is a pretty clear question. And I want to point out, this is God's mercy. He could have summarily executed them. He could have finished everything right there. But God reached out to Adam and Eve and gave them an opportunity. And by the time we're done with this interview, there's a promise of redemption. We have to wait until next week to get into that. But at this particular point in time, God's reaching out to them and he's saying to them, "Why are you hiding? Why? This is me. Why are you hiding from me?" And Adam's fear-filled response is, "I heard you, and boy, it didn't sound good." And so God gives him the direct question, "Did you?" What should have his response been? "Yes, I did, and I am so sorry." There's no excuse. But since the fall, that's not human nature, is it? It's all about deflection. So Adam's failure right here was that he deflects attention instead of owning his failure. He didn't deny, he just deflected. Who did he deflect to? The one that he did it for. That's how much things changed from one moment to the next. He was willing to go with her to perdition before the fall. After the fall, it's like, "You're on your own, kid." He ignores his failure in guardianship and spiritual leadership. He ignores that. He doesn't own that. He should have said, "Lord, I didn't keep everyone out of the garden. I did not lead Eve correctly, and I jumped in with her. I did this thing." But he doesn't. He says, "It's the woman you gave me. You created and gave me so lovingly." The woman owns her failure. She does a better job of it. I don't think she simply is saying, "I was deceived and I ate." So I think, and she admits it. Now she knows she was deceived. It's after you're done with the carny and he's got your $8. You can tell I'm wounded in this area. After he's got the $8 and you go, "I have just been scammed." And you've got knowledge now, but you don't like this knowledge because it's an awful feeling. As soon as she fell and she realized, oh, what a deception, she knew she had been had. And so she owns it right now. And here I'm telling you, and this is the end of the message because I couldn't go any further. We already a little bit long today. Not time-wise, but message time-wise. We need to own. When we do things wrong, we have to train ourselves to own it without excuse. Yep, I did it. Yep, I did it, but you're about to deflect. Yep, I did it. There's no excuse. Because there's always reasons. But the issue isn't the reason. The issue is, did you do it? And so you can say, "Yes, I did it." The person asking the questions may say, is there any circumstances that you might want to share with me about why you did it? See, then the door's being open, but you haven't deflected. You haven't walked away from the guilt because you've owned it. The Lord can forgive when we own it. He can't forgive excuses. You understand? Because it's not true repentance. And now no one repents perfectly. Okay, so he came into the garden in a spirit of judgment, and next week we're going to see him mete out judgment. And it's good, and it's bad. So come on back next week, and we'll look at it a little bit more closely. And if you've never heard me teach on it, you're in for some interesting insights. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this opportunity to study your word and to understand more about how Adam and Eve fell into sin. I ask that as we together grow in you, that we might be people who own our sin, because your word says clearly that we have sin. We stumble in many ways. And as we come before you, help us to be those who own it and find forgiveness and are able to go on in our relationship with you. In your name, amen.